Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to explore how people construct reality at work and how that construction shapes the decisions they make. The big idea is that behavior is driven less by objective reality and more by what people think is happening. Two people can be in the same meeting, hear the same words, and walk out with completely different interpretations of what was decided, what was meant, and who is responsible. It's because perception is an active process. We filter, organize, and interpret information to give it meaning. And once meaning is assigned, decision making follows. Let's start with perception. Perception is the process by which individuals organize and interpret their sensory impressions in order to give meaning to their environment. In organizations, perception is central because you're almost never reacting directly to facts. You're reacting to signals, partial information, social cues, norms, assumptions, and stories. You interpret the signal, you decide what it means, and then you act as if your interpretation is true. This is why, in organizational behavior, we often say that people behave based on their perception of reality, not reality itself. What shapes perception? Three broad forces. First, the perceiver. Your attitudes, personality, motives, interests, past experiences, and expectations all color what you notice and how you interpret it. If you expect a colleague to be unreliable, you'll notice lateness more than punctuality. If you're anxious about your status, you'll interpret neutral feedback as criticism. Second, the target. We respond differently depending on what stands out about the person, object, or event. If someone has a distinctive accent, job title, or style, that feature can become the hook your mind uses to fill in the rest. Third, the context. Time, place, social setting, and situational factors shape attention and interpretation. The same comment lands differently if it's said in a performance review versus at a casual coffee break, or if it's said publicly versus privately. Now let's move to person perception, how we make judgments about other people. A foundational lens here is attribution, the stories we tell about what caused someone's behavior. When you watch a coworker interrupt someone, or miss a deadline, or deliver an exceptional presentation, your brain almost automatically tries to answer a causal question. Why did that happen? Attribution theory says we tend to decide whether the behavior was caused mainly by internal factors, something about the person, or external factors, something about the situation. Internally caused behaviors are interpreted as under the person's control, personality, effort, ability, and motives. Externally caused behaviors are interpreted as the situation forcing the behavior. Unclear instructions, lack of resources, conflicting demands, bad luck, and organizational barriers. Attribution theory also gives us three cues people use to decide between internal and external causes. Distinctiveness asks, does the person behave this way in many situations, or only this one? If someone is rude to everyone, we're more likely to say, they're rude. If they're rude only in one meeting, we're more likely to look for a situational trigger. Consensus asks, do other people behave similarly in the same situation? If everyone struggles with the new software, you attribute one person's struggle to the situation. If only one person struggles, you're more likely to attribute it to the person. Consistency asks, does the person behave this way over time? If the behavior repeats, internal attributions become more likely. If it's a one-off, external attributions feel more plausible. This sounds rational and clean. But here's the problem. In real organizations, we rarely have full information for distinctiveness, consensus, and consistency. We don't actually see most of what shapes behavior. We see outcomes and fragments, and then we fill the gaps with assumptions. That gap filling is where systematic attribution errors appear. Two attribution biases are especially important. The first is the fundamental attribution error. Our tendency to underestimate external forces and overestimate internal forces when explaining other people's behavior. If someone cuts you off in a meeting, you think they're arrogant, rather than they're under extreme deadline pressure, or they're used to a more aggressive conversational style, or they misunderstood the turn taking norm in this group. The second is the self serving bias. We attribute our successes to internal factors like skill or effort, and our failures to external factors like bad luck or unfair circumstances. If your project goes well, it's because you're competent. If it goes poorly, it's because the client was unreasonable. These biases are psychologically comforting, but they distort learning, teamwork, and fairness. Culture can also influence attributions. Different cultural contexts vary in the extent to which people default to individual explanations versus situational explanations. What that means practically is that in multinational teams, people can disagree not only about what happened, but about why it happened. And those differences can escalate conflict if they're not recognized. Because the world is complex and our attention is limited, we also rely on shortcuts when judging others. Sometimes these shortcuts are efficient and good enough. But in high stakes contexts such as hiring, evaluation, promotion, conflict, and ethics, these shortcuts can create significant distortions. Let's talk through the common ones. Selective perception is the tendency to notice and interpret information consistent with our existing beliefs, expectations, and interests. You cannot process everything, so you filter. The danger is that the filter can become self-reinforcing. You see what you expect to see. The halo effect is when one positive characteristic, like confidence, attractiveness, a prestigious university, or polished speech, spills over into a general positive evaluation. The Horns effect is the mirror image. One negative characteristic dominates your impression. Contrast effects happen when you evaluate someone relative to the people you encountered just before. For example, an average candidate can look excellent after a weak interview, or weak after a strong one. Stereotyping is judging someone based on group membership, assuming that a perceived category predicts traits or behavior. Stereotyping can feel like an efficient prediction tool, but it can distort decisions, reduce fairness, and create self-fulfilling cycles. These biases matter because organizations run on judgments. Judgments about who is capable, who is trustworthy, who is leadership material, who deserves opportunities. Consider the employment interview. Research consistently finds that interviewers often form impressions quickly, and those early impressions can become entrenched. Once the mind decides yes or no, it tends to interpret later information in a way that supports the early conclusion. That creates a major risk. You think you are evaluating, but you are actually confirming. Now connect this to performance expectations. There's a concept called the self-fulfilling prophecy, sometimes called the Pygmalion effect. When leaders expect more from someone, they often behave in ways that subtly increase that person's performance. They offer more attention, more coaching, more challenging assignments, and more patience. Conversely, low expectations can lead to fewer opportunities and less support, which then produces lower performance, confirming the original expectation. This isn't magic. It's behavior shaped by belief. And that is perception turning into reality through social interaction. Performance evaluations are another area where perception strongly shapes outcomes. Even when evaluation systems appear objective, many roles include subjective components, which are vulnerable to halo effects, selective perception, contrast effects, and attribution biases. If you believe someone is a top performer, you interpret ambiguous outcomes generously. If you believe someone is weak, you interpret the same ambiguity as evidence of incompetence. A modern extension of this is social media. It's now easier than ever to gather information about candidates and employees. But more information doesn't automatically mean better decisions. Social media introduces new bias channels, especially similarity bias. People tend to like people who seem like them. If a candidate's visible identity signals shared values or affiliations, the evaluator may interpret them as more likable and capable. Using social media can also create legal risks when it indirectly reveals protected characteristics or enables discriminatory patterns. So, how does perception link to decision making? Decision making starts when someone recognizes a problem, a gap between the current state and a desired state. But what counts as a problem is often a matter of perception. One manager sees a dip in performance and thinks it's a motivation problem. Another sees the same dip and thinks it's a process design problem. Those different perceptions trigger different decisions. And every step of decision making, what information you seek, what you trust, what options you consider, what risks you tolerate, is shaped by perception. In organizations, we often teach a rational model of decision making. The rational model assumes a decision maker can define the problem clearly, identify criteria, weigh them, generate all alternatives, evaluate them objectively, and pick the best option. It's a useful ideal. It provides structure. But in real life, the assumptions rarely hold. Information is incomplete. Time is limited. People are emotionally invested. Politics exists. And goals conflict. That's where bounded rationality comes in. Bounded rationality recognizes that humans operate with limited information, limited attention, and limited computational capacity. So instead of optimizing, people satisfice. They search until they find an option that is good enough, and then stop. This is not necessarily laziness, it's adaptation. In complex environments, trying to optimize everything can become impossible or even dysfunctional. Sometimes you can spend so much time analyzing that the decision context changes, making the analysis irrelevant. So, bounded rationality is a realistic model of how decisions often happen. Intuition is the third piece. Intuitive decision making is fast, non conscious, and effectively charged. It draws on distilled experience and pattern recognition. Intuition can be powerful, especially in domains where someone has deep expertise and receives consistent feedback. But intuition can also be biased, especially when the environment is noisy, feedback is delayed, or stereotypes and emotions contaminate judgments. The smart approach is not trust intuition or reject intuition. The smart approach is treat intuition as a hypothesis generator, and then test it with data and structured reasoning when the stakes are high. Now let's talk about common decision biases that creep in precisely because of bounded rationality and intuitive shortcuts. Overconfidence bias is when people believe their judgments are more accurate than they are. Overconfidence can lead to underestimating risk, failing to seek dissent, and ignoring warning signs. Anchoring bias occurs when you fixate on initial information and fail to adjust enough as new information arrives. Anchors can show up in negotiations, forecasting, budgeting, and even performance ratings. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek and overweight information that supports what you already believe, while discounting contradictory evidence. Availability bias is when you base judgments on information that comes easily to mind, often because it's vivid, recent, or emotionally salient, rather than on information that is most representative. Escalation of commitment is a particularly important organizational bias. This is when people continue investing in a decision even when evidence suggests it's failing. Why does this happen? Often, because people feel responsible for the original decision, backing down feels like an admission of incompetence. Escalation is driven by identity, sunk costs, and social pressure. Randomness error is when people create patterns or meaning in random events, believing outcomes are predictable when they're not. Risk aversion is the tendency to prefer a sure outcome over a risky one, even when the risky option has higher expected value, and framing effects matter here. People often become risk averse when facing gains and risk seeking when facing losses. Hindsight bias is believing after the fact that you knew it all along, which distorts learning because it makes outcomes feel predictable. Outcome bias is judging the quality of a decision primarily by whether the outcome was good, rather than by whether the process was sound. A lucky outcome can follow a bad decision, and a bad outcome can follow a good decision. If you evaluate only outcomes, you train people to avoid smart risks and to worship luck. If you're thinking like a master's level OB student, you should now be asking, what shapes susceptibility to these biases? Individual differences matter. Personality can shape risk-taking and persistence. Self-esteem can amplify self-serving bias because people are motivated to protect their self-image. Cognitive ability can help people process information more effectively, but it doesn't immunize them from bias, especially when emotions and identity are involved. Culture shapes how people define problems, how much they value rationality versus harmony, whether decisions are expected to be made individually or collectively, and how time orientation affects urgency. Gender research often supports similarities more than differences, but patterns sometimes appear in areas like sensation seeking and risk taking, and those differences can interact with organizational context rather than determining behavior on their own. Organizational constraints also shape decision making. People rarely decide in a vacuum. Performance evaluation systems tell managers what matters, and managers will predictably prioritize what they are evaluated on. Reward systems signal which choices yield personal payoff, which can push decisions toward self-interest rather than organizational interests. Formal regulations restrict options. Time constraints reduce information gathering and increase reliance on heuristics. Historical precedent shapes what feels reasonable, which is why budgets often resemble last year's budget more than a fresh analysis of needs. And during crises, decision makers become more emotional and more vulnerable to distortion. Under stress, people can become more risk-seeking for negative outcomes and more risk-averse for positive ones. And perceptions of fairness become especially important because employees and customers watch how decisions are made, not just what decisions are made. Now let's move into ethics, because ethical decision-making is where perception and bias become high stakes. Ethical choices are not only about knowing what is right, they're also about how people actually behave when under pressure, facing ambiguous norms, or trying to meet unrealistic goals. There are three classic ethical decision criteria that leaders tend to rely on, often implicitly. The first is utilitarianism. Choose the option that produces the greatest good for the greatest number, focusing on outcomes. This can support efficiency and productivity, but it can also justify harming minorities or sidelining rights. The second is a focus on rights. Make decisions consistent with fundamental liberties and protections like privacy and free speech. This protects individuals from harm, but it can create a legalistic environment that slows action. The third is a focus on justice. Enforce rules fairly and distribute benefits and burdens equitably. This protects the less powerful, but it can sometimes create perceptions of entitlement or reduce risk-taking if people believe outcomes should always be equal regardless of effort. A modern development in this area is behavioral ethics, the study of how people actually behave in ethical dilemmas. Behavioral ethics highlights that many unethical actions are not driven by villainy. They're driven by blind spots, rationalizations, ambiguous norms, pressure, and identity-based self-justification. People often say, "I'm a good person," and then reinterpret questionable actions as necessary, deserved, or harmless. One reason ethical failures surprise organizations is that they assume ethics is primarily about character. Behavioral ethics shows it's also about situation design, incentives, monitoring, speaking up systems, leadership signals, and cultural norms. A practical implication is that organizations reduce unethical behavior not only through punishment, but through clarity and environmental design. If norms are ambiguous, victims are invisible, and goals are unrealistic, unethical behavior becomes more likely. So, effective ethics management includes making expectations explicit, creating credible consequences, encouraging voice and whistleblowing protections, and building formal and informal systems that detect and prevent everyday misconduct, not just major scandals. This brings us to creativity and innovation, because creative decisions are also shaped by perception, bounded rationality, and environment design. Creativity is the ability to produce novel and useful ideas. The useful part matters. Something can be novel and still be worthless. In organizations, creativity isn't just a personality trait, it's a process and a system. There's a helpful way to think about creative behavior as a sequence. First, problem formulation. Identifying a problem or opportunity where the solution is not yet known. The way you frame the problem determines the space of possible solutions. If you frame a problem too narrowly, you limit creativity. If you frame it too vaguely, you get scattered ideas. Second, information gathering and incubation. Learning, exploring, and letting the mind process possibilities. Third, idea generation. Combining knowledge into potential solutions. Fourth, idea evaluation. Selecting and refining ideas into an implementable direction. What causes creative behavior? Partly creative potential, traits like openness to experience, tolerance for ambiguity, perseverance, and confidence. Expertise matters too. Creativity often comes from deep knowledge that allows unusual combinations. But the environment is crucial. Motivation is one of the strongest drivers of creativity. If people aren't motivated to be creative, they won't invest the effort required. Leadership also matters, especially whether leaders create psychological safety, protect time for deep work, and reward experimentation without punishing smart failure. Diversity can increase creativity by expanding perspectives, but only under certain conditions, particularly when the team can manage conflict and integrate viewpoints. And ultimately, creative outcomes become innovation when relevant stakeholders judge an idea to be both novel and useful, and the organization can translate it into real results. Soft skills, like influence, collaboration, and communication, often determine whether good ideas survive the social process of implementation. So, what do you do with all of this as an advanced OB learner? Here are the practical takeaways, presented in a way you can apply immediately. First, treat perception as data. When you see puzzling behavior, don't jump to character explanations. Ask what the person might be perceiving, what constraints, threats, incentives, or norms are shaping their interpretation. Second, slow down your attributions. Before you label a person as lazy, incompetent, or toxic, actively consider situational explanations and ask what information you're missing. Third, in decisions, separate process quality from outcome quality. If you want a learning organization, reward sound decision processes, even when outcomes occasionally fail, and investigate outcomes without turning every failure into blame. Fourth, reduce bias structurally. Training helps, but structure helps more. Use consistent interview questions, defined evaluation criteria, diverse decision panels, pre-mortems for major choices, and explicit checkpoints where someone must argue the strongest opposing view. Fifth, in ethics, don't rely on good people narratives. Design systems that reduce temptation, clarify norms, protect voice, and align incentives with values. Sixth, for creativity, don't only hire creative people. Build a creative environment. Time, safety, resources, purpose, and recognition. Then teach teams to frame problems well and evaluate ideas fairly. If you take these ideas seriously, you get something powerful. You become someone who can predict organizational behavior more accurately because you understand the invisible layer beneath it, the interpretations, shortcuts, and constraints that shape what people do. And once you can see that layer, you can intervene more intelligently, whether your role is manager, consultant, researcher, or leader. Thank you for joining me today.